name is Julia Carson. I'm Otto Friedrich's eldest grandchild. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about my earliest memories and my fondest memories and some of the things that made his books important to me. The earliest moment that I could read and write, my grandfather began a very long correspondence with me. And they were always typed letters, and I always wrote by hand back. And he used the letters as he used every moment that he spent with most of us to teach us things. And because, when you're a child and you're completely self-centered, all you really want to write about is what you've done and what you've seen and what you've thought about, and you don't think anything of asking questions of the other person and responding to what they've written back to you. And so we had a long correspondence, sort of, monthly. I spent a lot of time in the summertime with my grandfather and my grandmother in their home in Oyster Bay, Long Island. What stays with me to this day is the way that when I went out there in the summer times, it was the only place I've ever visited where reading was really the main, central, and only activity. They read all day, every day, day after day, or wrote. There was really not much else that happened. I always began the week at a loss about which book to choose because his collection was so extensive and so unchild-friendly. I would always search for books that happened to have a colorful spine or had some promise of action or a story that I could relate to. And the closest thing I could come to, the only books with a colorful spine, were this 13-volume set of Chekhov's short stories, which at 10 were totally baffling and incomprehensible to me. But I guess for my grandfather, the moment you became a person in his eyes, not the moment when you were born, but the moment when you were able to read and write and hold up your end of a sustained conversation. And I knew from a very early age that the best way to engage him was to ask him a question, preferably a really big, difficult question that he could then sit and explain to me for hours and hours and hours on end. So questions like, Grandpa, please explain what caused World War I. That would be a really good conversation starter for Otto Friedrich. We had these conversations, but really most of the day he was in the part of the house which was totally off limits to me as a child, which was his work study. And because he was a writer, everything else came second to his work time. And the study would be connected to the living room where he had his own reading couch. And then the rest of us shared another couch where we were allowed to sit. And in his work study, the double French doors would close and you would just hear slow tap, tap, tapping. He only used 2 fingers to type on his ancient typewriter. And he steadfastly produced about 2 pages per day of whatever was the next book that he was working on. I remember always listening to him play the piano. He, in his youth, aspired to be a concert pianist and drove himself to practice for hours and hours each day. By the time he was my grandfather, he had finally accepted that he would not have the talent ever to be the concert pianist he always wanted to be, but he never gave up practicing. And he wrote a book about Glenn Gould, but really he aspired to be Glenn Gould in a sense. I mean, he would practice the Goldberg variations. I remember it's the music I most associate with him. Whenever I visited them, they were some of the only people I knew who really didn't watch television. And not only did they not watch television, but they didn't know how to work any kind of technology that was associated with the television, which for people who sort of came of age during the 50s and 60s is slightly unusual. My little sister Lucy, who doesn't remember this, but I do strongly, when she was finally 4 or 5 years old and had at last learned how to read and to decode words, announced to Grandpa that she knew how to read. And did Grandpa want to see her? And she was of course imagining that she would pull out some kind of Frog and Toad are friends. But my grandfather said, well, if you say you can read, you'll have to prove it. and he handed her a copy of Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, which was just the latest book that was on his coffee table in the living room. And Lucy proceeded to sound out the first page of that. And going from Dr. Seuss to decoding the word totalitarianism, I think would be a mouthful for anyone, but she managed to muddle her way through it, and he was very pleased. And from that day forward, she joined the inner circle of people who could read and write, who were old enough to prove that they were worthy of his attention. My grandfather was a really stubborn man. He was as stubborn in his work habits as he was in his drinking habit. Even when he was clearly and dangerously diabetic, he'd been told that the only juice he could drink was grapefruit juice. And so every morning he dutifully had a glass of this orange, sour, bitter, yellow grapefruit juice, and then proceeded, starting at lunchtime, to move through bottle after bottle of Giulio Gallo, But at the same time, he instilled in all of us, in my mom, who was his daughter, Molly Friedrich, and then in turn in me, that really no matter how hard you worked at anything, whether it was a book or a Goldberg variation or a thought, that you could never work hard enough, that the job was never really over. And I'm sure that he learned that in his own home, where he and I think most of his brothers and sisters were sort of intensely competitive. And that competitive spirit was never passed down to me, but I think the work ethic was. And I'm a teacher today. That's my profession. And I sometimes hear not his kind of lecture style. Well, I guess it is his lecture style, because when he sought to explain any major event or any question that I had about the world around me, his narrative was always compelling and essential. And it's that same narrative that I always try to include in what I teach my students. What's the most essential idea about what we're studying right now? And that voice is certainly his. And you can, if I open any one of his books, whether, The Grave of Alice B. Toklas, his voice is on every page. His narrative is on every page. It's sort of like the line of a painter that you can recognize. I can recognize him in all of his work. But I guess if I had to say what my favorite books are by Otto, by my grandpa, my favorite books would have to be the books that he wrote with my grandmother, because I think that they're the books where she was more visibly a part. I think that she was a part of every book because they were so inseparable. And I think that whatever he wrote, the question at the back of his mind, because my grandmother was so intensely bright and so underemployed, was, what would Priscilla think? And her criticism was probably the ultimate criticism, constructive or otherwise. And she was such a fine reader that the work that they produced together, I can see both of them most evidently in it. And I know that the children's book that is still published today, and is probably the most famous, the most classic, is The Easter Bunny That Overslept. But my personal favorites are Clarence the Clean Pig, or Clean Clarence, and The Marshmallow Ghosts. My grandfather's books, I can see him on every page, but whenever I pick up the children's books that he wrote with my grandmother, Priscilla Boughton Friedrich, I see both of them on every page, and she's a counterpart of each of those memories.